Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly live stream. This is a live discussion we do every week for our podcast. Weekly podcast is called Transformation Ground Control, and we film these core interviews live in front of an audience to get audience engagement and questions. So thank you for being here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And today's topic is AI's impact on digital transformations and ERP implementation. So we're going to talk about how AI is impacting, particularly on the procurement side, procuring software, the whole RFP process, procuring services, working with SIs. Just how is AI impacting the projects themselves? We've talked a lot in this podcast about how AI is being embedded in ERP systems and how operationally organizations are using AI, but we haven't really delved into AI's impact on the actual transformations themselves. So that's going to change today because we're going to dive into it here today with our guest, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But before I introduce our guest, a couple quick things. One is I mentioned that this is part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast. You can learn about that podcast or watch past episodes of that podcast by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And you can also subscribe to the show, catch up on past episodes, keep up with new ones, all that good stuff. So transformationgroundcontrol.com is the website. And secondly, we are going to take audience questions throughout the conversation here today. So I encourage you to please drop any questions you have along the way in the chat. Love to get your questions, your perspectives on how maybe you're seeing AI being used in your digital transformation projects, or just questions you have about how it might be used in your digital transformation initiatives. So please drop any questions you have along the way in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that here today, and I'll get to those questions as they come in. And speaking of the chat, if you don't mind, also just drop in the chat what city and country you're joining from today. I always love to see where the global audience is joining from. We tend to draw in a global digital transformation community, so would love to hear from you where you're joining from. So what city and country you're joining from today? Love to hear from you on that. I'm based out of Denver, Colorado. But today I'm in Miami, Florida at a client. So love to hear where you're from as well. And so joining me to discuss this great topic here today, AI's impact on digital transformations and ERP implementations, is a return guest. He's been on a couple times now on this podcast, but John Belden from Upper Edge. John, thanks for being here.
Hey, thank you, Eric, for having me today.
Absolutely. Good to see you again. Good to have you here. And I always learn a lot from you. So I'm excited to kind of learn with the audience here as we chat through this really interesting topic. But before I jump in and just start firing away questions at you, tell us a little bit about yourself and about Upper Edge as well.
Yeah, Upper Edge is a third-party advisory firm. We focus primarily on assisting our clients with the negotiations with, I'll call it, IT service providers and IT software and IT infrastructures. We're based out of Boston. We're veteran-owned. And probably what makes us most unique is we don't have any relationships with any of those actual IT service providers. So we are completely independent in our advice.
Yeah, great point, by the way. I mean, both your company, Upper Edge, my company, Third Stage Consulting, we're both independent, tech agnostic. So everything we talk about here today is from the context of not necessarily peddling any sort of vendor influence or pushing any sort of vendor. It's more generally
Correct.
Speaking from a tech agnostic perspective. So good point. So how did you, just before I dive into some of these questions, how did you end up in this space? I'm just curious, like start off your career years ago. Did you have this grand vision that you were going to be a guy that was going to help negotiate contracts and help clients through procurement processes?
Well,
how did you get into this?
Well, I've been in this space longer than I care to admit now, right? I mean, at least in the IT space. I spent 31 years with a large global manufacturing company called the Timken Company out of Canton, Ohio. And the final part of my career, let's call it the last 10 years of the career, I was primarily involved in IT transformations. And whether it be in the ERP space, the CRM space, the PDM space, all of those areas I spent a lot of time working in. I retired from Timken in 2013, and Dave Blake, the owner of Upper Edge, came and said, "Hey, John, you've spent a lot of time working with and negotiating with IT vendors post contract. Maybe we should develop a service for that." So I decided that I would join Dave on a part-time basis in 2013, and lo and behold, 11 years later, I'm still working in this space, assisting clients primarily in kind of the management of their vendors, and I'll call it in general. The last 18 months to 2 years, I've really been engaged in, let's call it generative AI, and understanding how generative AI is impacting the IT market in general. Not so much the foundational technologies of generative AI, but how is generative AI impacting, let's call it the systems implementation space and the ERP implementation space in general, since I had a lot of experience there.
Yeah, it's great, and I'm still waiting to meet that person that had a vision from the time they were a young kid about going into ERP or digital transformation. But it sounds like you're not going to be the first one, apparently, that tells me that story. But what's great, and it's such a you have such a unique view because you handle, you really focus in on that procurement side of things, that front end negotiation with clients, and helping establish relationships with software vendors and system integrators. And so that's sort of the perspective we want to take here today, and really understanding how AI could influence that. And one thing that's an important sort of disclaimer, if you will, one thing you and I were talking about right before we came on live here today, is that we're all kind of learning. This whole AI thing is so new to all of us, even you and I, who are
Right.
experts in the space. We're still learning this, and I think, what were your exact words? Anyone who says they know all this stuff or have
Yeah,
all the
anybody that claims to be an expert is a liar.
right, they're full of it. They
Yeah.
claim to be an expert at it. So you and I combined with the audience, maybe we sort of become a little bit of an expert here today, but we're all clearly learning as we go here. Um, so maybe just to start off here, you sent me a couple blogs, and you're a prolific blogger and writer. You put out a lot of really good content on the Upper Edge website, and I saw a blog recently that you shared with me that was about AI and how it's being used in procurement, in IT procurement. So can you talk a little bit, based on what you wrote about in your blog and just some of your experience in general, what are some of the key challenges that CIOs and IT procurement teams face when they're leading the AI revolution?
Yeah, I mean, it was something I put a good deal of thought into, in terms of, if I was back in my seat as a CIO, or I was leading the procurement office, what would I be thinking about in terms of generative AI? And the first thing that came to my mind, and again, this is just, I think everybody talks about this. How is generative AI impacting procurement in general? Right. In other words, how's that going to modify and impact the processes of procurement? And there's been a lot written about that, right? And I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on the procurement process in general. But if you're not thinking about the procurement process as a CPO or a CIO, um, you're gonna end up in a lot of trouble, because on the other side, let's call it the sales teams. They're going to be armed, especially in the IT industry, with generative AI on their side, selling to you, right? And so you're going to have to at least be able to say, how am I going to sustain my position and sustain my leverage when I know the other side is going to be coming to market with a lot of new tools, right? So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is just, what do I need to do and what do I need to understand to purchase generative AI technology? As you said, this is a completely brand new space, right? And just getting educated on the terminology associated with generative AI. What are the pieces, parts that I actually need to procure? And what are the services associated with it, right? So that's kind of number two. Number three is going to be the systems integration space. Let's take it: Accenture, PwC, EY, all of those companies. They've invested $15 billion or more in generative AI technology to modify their processes and deliver services to their clients, right? That whole space of service delivery, I think we're going to see dramatic changes to in the next 2 years. I think we've just seen the tip of the iceberg, but I think we're going to see that whole fundamental space just change, right? And so, as a procurement officer, you're going to have to be thinking about that. I think then there's managing the risks associated with generative AI and understanding what those risks are, not only for the implementation of generative AI in your organization, but understanding the risk profile of vendors that are using generative AI to deliver services to you, and what's the pass through of those risks, right? And what are you doing? I'll call it, to mitigate or at least assume that risk profile along with your own. The sixth thing I put down there was regulatory and privacy concerns, right? Understanding, what your obligations are for, I'll call it, in generative AI, what your obligations are going to be as these regulations pass, and what you're going to be responsible for and accountable for in terms of communicating your use of generative AI. And then maybe the last thing I would be thinking about would be every IT supplier out there today is implementing generative AI in some aspect, whether they're putting it into their products or putting it into their service offerings. And recognizing that all of those firms are going to be gaining some level of productivity associated with the generative AI. How are you, as a client of those firms, going to pull through savings, right, that they're actually realizing in their companies for generative AI? How are you going to pull that through and pull that into your supply chain, right? I almost liken it to when a lot of companies were going offshore, right? When those companies were going offshore, their costs were reduced. They passed some of that through to their clients on those cost reductions, right? Same thing's going to be with generative AI. How are you going to pull that through? So to me, those were kind of the 7 things I wrote about in the blog as things that procurement officers and CIOs need to think about in terms of the implications of generative AI.
Yeah, super interesting stuff. And I think what you're talking about here are things that a lot of organizations just aren't thinking about. Is that something you're finding, like when you work with a new team, are they already sort of thinking this stuff, or is it you sort of trying to
I
educate them?
think in many cases, it's us kind of priming the pump with those thoughts of things that need to be done. Most companies are thinking about generative AI kind of in the forms of chat GPT, right? And how am I going to use chat GPT? And they're testing it out, but I don't see many companies necessarily thinking about as broadly as what I laid out there. That was one of the reasons I kind of put out those 7 questions, is to just get the thought process started on what are you going to do with generative AI, because it's bigger than chat GPT.
Yeah. Yeah, and just a couple follow-up questions then from what you just went through, which is a great summary list of what you outlined in your blog, those 6 or 7 things. But you talked about one of the first things you mentioned was that um, when you're being sold to from a software vendor system integrator, they're using generative AI, and so therefore you sort of need to counteract that with your own
Right.
use of generative AI. Can you give us a couple examples of how you're seeing, or how you might suggest a organization use generative AI in the sales or procurement process of new software and services?
Yeah, I think from that standpoint, where we are exploring the use of supporting clients in the use of generative AI, because a lot of companies can't necessarily afford the infrastructure associated with it, right? But areas where the most obvious one is, I'll call it the negotiation strategies just in general that tend to be embedded inside of the generative AI tools today, right? I mean, they're very good at assisting clients with the actual negotiations. But I think broader than that, the ability to actually use generative AI to compare proposals, and ask the question, well, I'm getting this from vendor A, I'm getting this from vendor B. Are they actually quoting on the same thing? To me, that's a potential use case for generative AI that maybe hasn't been fully explored. Being able to look at proposals from a risk analysis point of view or a gap analysis point of view, to be able to say, does this actually include everything in it that I would have expected to be in it? Does it meet the requirements of my RFP? Right. So if I've completed a very comprehensive RFP, generative AI is very capable of saying, does everything that you asked for in this document appear in some form to be answered in this document? Right. So being able to rapidly kind of assess the proposals and reduce the cycle time associated with how long it actually takes to evaluate a proposal, to me, is really important. And then there's some levels of benchmarking, but benchmarking is a lot more difficult, at least from my perspective, with generative AI, because the information associated that you need, right, in order to be able to actually say, is this a good rate? Is this a good price? All of that stuff isn't typically publicly available out there, right? It's not published unless it's a government contract, right? So being able to use that to be able to actually make the evaluation from a commercial standpoint still more difficult today.
Yeah. Yeah, that's sound advice. And even just the comparison, you get these big, massive proposals back from software vendors. And oftentimes, one of the things, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts here. A lot of times we see clients struggle with apples to apples comparisons. I
Right.
got two proposals from two different software vendors. You would think on the surface they're probably pretty similar, but you dig in and you start to see that these are not. There's different costs and timelines and assumptions and things. And so using generative AI to really highlight some of those, I could see that being a pretty powerful tool.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where I'm going to tell you my belief is, and my I'll call it research shows, it's there's something that's called a context window in generative AI. It's essentially how much information I can be thinking about simultaneously, right? The generative AI packages today have it's much greater than it was 18 months ago, but they still have a limited context window of when you're trying to bring in a lot of information and say compare a lot of information. Sometimes that context window is a restrictor on looking at a 100-page proposal or a 250-page proposal and comparing one to the other, right? And so you almost have to do it in pieces and in pieces parts. So it's still a little bit kludgy today, but I think when the next generation of generative AI comes out, I think that context window is going to be resolved.
Yeah, yeah, makes total sense. I want to turn to the audience real quick before I circle back with another follow up question for you, John. But I want to say hello to Terry, who's joining from Germany. Darian's joining from Denver. We've got someone joining from LA, although I don't see the name. A couple people joining from Los Angeles here today. So thank you for being here today. Here's a question I want to get to that I think is a good one, and I don't see the name of the person asking this question, so I apologize. But this is from LinkedIn, and the person on LinkedIn says, "Yes, I get many sales pitches from vendors touting their AI capabilities. When negotiating or partner with vendors, would you consider their AI capabilities in a digital transformation? Where do you link SI generative AI capabilities compared to other capabilities that SIs can bring?"
Yeah, so I'm going to put that into two different categories, right? Category one is the capabilities to implement generative AI.
Mm,
Category two is use of generative AI in deployment of their services in general, right? How are they internally using generative AI to support you in their processes and methodologies? Um, what we've seen to date, and I'm going to take the second category first, okay? What we've seen to date is by and large, the large systems integrators' use of generative AI technology is has been through the use of what I'm going to refer to as everyday AI, right? So that would be the Chat GPTs, the GitHubs, even to the extent Google searches. And what most of these SIs are claiming today is anywhere between a 5 and 15% productivity impact associated with just the implementation of generative AI.
mm,
Now, most of the systems integrators are also embedding generative AI into their methodologies themselves, right? And saying, okay, we're going to actually deliver our service leveraging generative AI. But I believe, and we haven't seen it come full out into the market yet. And I think part of what the systems integrators are dealing with is even in best cases, right? Even in best cases, generative AI provides a really well-founded complete answer about 93% of the time, right? 7% of the time, there's some sort of error or some sort of flaw or something that isn't quite right about that generative AI response. And
right.
when you think about it from a computer science perspective, right, we were always trained that the response that comes out of the computer needs to be right 100% of the time. So now how do you implement a methodology with tool sets that are right 93% of the time? And what's your process governance that's going to make sure, right, that the 7% of the time that the information is not accurate, you're going to hold back or not deliver it to the customer? And what's your quality check on that? That, by and large, those quality checks have been removed from the SI processes. And so now they're having to figure out, how do I implement this technology to get the savings, but at the same time don't sacrifice quality?
Right. Yeah.
right?
Great questions. And it's, it's not like how you and I grew up in the IT space where you get a binary quantitative piece of data for the most part out of a system. Now you're talking about qualitative, objective type stuff that you're getting out of AI, which is totally different. It's just a different way of thinking too. But
Yeah,
you're right.
it really is almost like dealing with a person, right? And dealing with a new employee, right? And I like to say it's like dealing with a brand new employee that believes that they are the smartest, most confident employee that you've ever dealt with in your entire life when they give
Right.
you the answer, right? And so there's a certain amount of confidence that these tools kind of push out that make you believe that the answer is actually accurate. And unless you have a fundamental understanding of the subject matter to begin with, right, you don't know if it's wrong.
Right. Right. It's like that super smart person that's new to the company. You still have to train them. They still have to learn the ropes. You have to sort of course correct, at times. And that's a lot like how AI is too. AI has to learn just as much as you're learning from it. So
Right. And how do you correct it when it's wrong? And how do you know that it's
how do
wrong
you
in
know it's
order to be
wrong?
able to correct it? Right. I mean, that's a challenge I think that the industry is facing right now.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Here's an interesting question that sort of leads into a follow up I'm going to have for you too, John. But this is from Pranav on YouTube. Pranav says, This is Pranav from London. I know the session is tech agnostic, but in terms of future ERP roles, what impact do you see? In other words, how would AI help solution architects and functional consultants? So maybe just sort of back up, how are you seeing AI affect individual consultants and individual people? I know you mentioned, and I'm going to come back to this point. I know you mentioned Accenture and some of the big SIs are implementing
Yeah.
$15 billion or whatever it is in AI. But how is it affecting individuals that are working on these projects from what you're
Yeah,
seeing?
I think it's a great question. I mean, I think it's going to change the profile of people that are actually working on ERP projects in general. Um, and I don't want to get, I'm going to get forecasting ish right now, but I think the largest impact on the jobs associated with generative AI are going to be on what I would call traditional coding jobs, functional design jobs, testing jobs, training development jobs, right? I mean, a lot of those jobs are going to be impacted. Um, I think there's going to be new roles that are going to evolve, right, with the implementation of generative AI. I said testing. I'm going to say testing, testing in the traditional sense, right? There's going to be a brand new role, I think, associated with how do you actually test generative AI implementations, right? What is the strategy? How are you going to do that, right? I mean, we just kind of went through the process of kind of discussing it. Sometimes it gives you false answers, right? Or it gives you the hallucination. Well, it doesn't necessarily give you the same answer twice, right? I can ask you, Eric, what's the weather like today, right? And you're going to tell me, well, it's going to be cloudy and a chance of rain, right?
Right.
And I can ask you exactly that same question 5 minutes from now, and you might give me the answer, yeah, it's going to be okay. It's just like yesterday, right? Well, both answers are correct, right?
Right.
And so from that standpoint, when you're developing a testing strategy for generative AI, what does that look like, right? And what's that profession going to look like to develop that strategy? I think that fundamentally is going to change on ERP implementations and how people think about that. To me, that's going to be the biggest change.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in sort of following up and sort of moving up a level here, when we look at the big SIs and some of these
Yeah,
larger firms that are investing heavily in
yeah.
generative AI, how are you? Do you see examples of where their processes are changing as a result of embedding AI in their implementation processes?
Yeah, I think, well, and I think where we're going to see it, like I said, we're going to see it in development. We're going to see it in testing. We're going to see it in training development for sure.
Mhm.
I think where most firms are claiming that they're seeing benefits today is in the area of program and project management. And it's the ability to kind of look across all of the documentation that's being generated by the project itself and summarizing that documentation, right, and rolling that up into some sort of a digestible firm. It's not necessarily looking at the project plans in general, but the ability to look across multiple, a large program with a lot of different status reports going on, and asking generative AI to do things like analyze all this information, pull out what you think is the most critical of that, surface those things, put this in the context or a form that a CIO or a CPO or a transformation officer can digest. I think they can do that a lot more rapidly now than what they could just a year ago.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. And it's interesting hearing you talk about this, because there's so many really manual processes in implementations that can be sped up or accelerated here. You talked about development, training, testing. I mean, those are three really big ones. Data migration,
Right.
data cleansing, like look for all the,
Exactly.
remove all the duplicate records, or all the, merge together all the duplicate records in this set of data. And, using AI for something like that could be pretty powerful and save a lot of time.
Yeah, and I think largely this, you know, I think it's going to save a lot of time, but I don't think initially it's going to save a lot of money, right? Because the initial impact of generative AI, I think, is going to formulate around a lot of those jobs that were taken offshore to begin with, right?
Right.
So the monetary impact associated that with those is going to be small, right? Now, having said that, right, I think there's also a potential for a big impact if the clients know what they're doing on reducing the costs on their side as well, not just the SI side, right? So in developing their agreements with their SI, making sure that the client can access and leverage the SI tool sets to deliver on their own accountabilities also, to me, is going to provide a terrific opportunity for clients. So when we think about the testing in general, right, most of the time the SI will say, well, the client has responsibilities for developing the test scripts, right, or the client has responsibilities of coming up with the integration strategies.
Right.
To the extent that the SI doesn't make their tool sets available to the client in order to actually execute those processes, right, the client, I think, is missing out, right? So it's one of those things where if they're in a competitive process and you're in a competitive situation, I would absolutely be pressing on how can I leverage your tool sets in order to be able to mitigate my risk as a client on delivery of this project, and where can those necessarily help me, not through your consultants actually using the tools, but allowing my people to leverage your tool sets to deliver my obligations.
Right. Right. Makes total sense. Now, what about if we shift gears and talk about, maybe moving outside of the actual procurement process? And I know we've been talking about how to use AI
Right.
potentially in implementations themselves. What about selecting a platform, like an AI platform in general, not just for the implementation, but maybe for the organization as a whole? I know you told me before this interview that you're writing a blog or a white paper on this topic. Tell
Right.
us a little bit about maybe a preview of what you're finding or what you're thinking about in that blog, and how you might address that.
Yeah. So it's been really interesting for me, because as part of it is when you're thinking about ERP packages in general, you sit there and say, okay, what are the pieces parts of an ERP package? Well, there's the FI section, there's the procurement section, there's the there's the supply chain planning section. Those become very, very familiar, right? And so from my standpoint, it was at least beginning to understand what are the components of an AI infrastructure that I'm ultimately going to have to buy, right? And so part of the paper just goes through and says, hey, let's just break this down to say, how can we organize this thing into categories so that when I go to compare vendors, right, I've got something that I know that I can develop, let's call it a common nomenclature that I can use when I'm comparing vendors' products. So we've broken that down into 5 general areas. There's the data management area, right, which deals with data integration, pre-processing, governance, and quality monitoring. There's a model development section, right, that says, okay, I'm going to develop models. So that's going to contain framework, libraries. How do I build custom models? How do I do automatic machine learning, et cetera? Then there's a section associated with inference and deployment, right? So now you're thinking about, How do I do real-time inferences? How do I do batch inferences? How do I serve my model, right? How do I incorporate my model into potentially a product that I'm putting out there? And what are the tool sets associated with that? Then there's, I'll call it machine learning ops and governance. And then finally, I'll call it the integration capabilities, right? How do I connect an API? How do I do data integration? How do I do the interoperability? So it really is saying, okay, those are the 5 main sections. Now, how are you going to define your requirements in each one of those 5 main sections as you think about buying the products themselves? And the crux of the paper is just kind of laying that out so that we can all talk about it the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've also been a proponent of this phase zero concept
Yeah.
for AI and choosing a platform and embedding AI in your overall digital strategy longer term. Tell us a little bit about that. What should organizations be thinking about as they start to plan for or kind of go into this phase zero of potential AI adoption?
Yeah, so phase zero is really interesting, and I'm sure you're, whenever you're doing an ERP program, you normally do, whether you call it a phase zero or not, right? You're normally doing something up front that you're going to refer to as a strategy, right? And that strategy is typically, how am I going to go from point A to point B, right? And point B oftentimes is reasonably defined by the market, right? It is, okay, there's a product out there, or there's a state that I want to have my organization in, right? And I want to be able to achieve that state. And that state's defined maybe by business KPIs, or some sort of profitability performance or something like that. But you can readily define it. The phase zero for generative AI, though, to me is it's a really, really interesting space to think about, because first of all, you're going to have to say, how am I going to rapidly assess across my organization where is going to be the impact of generative AI, right? I mean, it's not like I'm going to say, where am I going to apply ERP? This generative AI is so broad that figuring out what that whole landscape is going to look like and where am I going to put it, that's a really, really tough problem to solve, right? Then the second question you have to deal with is, am I going to embed generative AI in my products? Or am I just going to use it in my processes? Or am I going to try to do both? Because the technology requirements associated with embedding it in your products is fundamentally different than just keeping it in-house, right? And not exposing it to your clients itself. The third thing you got to think about that may be different than traditional phase zeros is, I've got a wide landscape of we mentioned, of where generative AI is going to have an impact. How am I going to handle the non-strategic areas, right, that I'm not going to put my IT department on, knowing, right, that everybody in the organization, that's reasonably talented is going to be trying to apply generative AI on their own, almost like end user computing was, right? Go back 20 years ago. Oh, I've got a PC. I'm going to start developing my applications. I'm going to start using generative AI. How are you as an enterprise going to control / manage, or at least harness all of that work that's going on with generative AI in your enterprise that's not strategic, right? The third or the fourth question then is, how am I going to balance, like we talked about with the systems integrators, how am I going to balance savings, right, versus accuracy, knowing that generative AI is not going to be, I'll call it foolproof. What are you going to do with your phase zero to think about that question? And how are you going to begin to embed those quality controls again? And then I think the last thing on generative AI is really fully understanding the risk profile associated with generative AI when you take on a phase zero, is becoming really familiar with those risks and understanding what the implications of those risks are on your organization.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of risk, what are some of the risks? We think about generative AI, both in terms of our implementation and transformation itself, but also just in our usage of AI day to day in our operations. What are some of the risks that you're seeing so far?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've already talked about a couple of them. Testing is one for sure, right? It says, how are you actually going to do testing? I think market volatility is something that, in the ERP space, we don't think about market volatility anymore, right? You don't think about, is Oracle going to be around? Is SAP going to be around? You don't even think
Right.
about that. But you certainly have to think about it now in this space of generative AI, right? You take a company like, OpenAI out there right now. I mean, do you know if they're going to be around 2 years from now or not, right? Is Sam Altman going to go join somebody else to do that, right? I mean, that you're seeing that all the time. You're seeing things like, I heard a new term and I found out it wasn't a new term, but they called it acqui-hire, or acqui-hiring, right? And acqui-hiring is companies, instead of doing an acquisition, right, to go out and buy some of these firms, what they're doing is they're going out to those firms and they're just hiring the top talent out of those firms, leaving the firms as kind of shell firms to die on the vine, right? And they're doing that to a certain extent to bypass regulatory things associated with antitrust. And they're saying, you know what? I don't want your IP. I don't want your software. I just want your people that dealt with that problem, because I have that problem here and I'm going to hire the whole team to come over here and do this, right? So the firm may exist, right? But the people that were there to begin with don't exist, right? So there's all of that kind of market volatility. Then there's this, I'll call it compute uncertainty. And when you're buying these products out there today, lots of them I'll say are costed by the level of compute power that they use in order to be able to deliver the answer, or let's call it the tokens that are produced by the answer, right? Well, what control do you have as an organization of the underlying compute intensity associated with a particular LLM? And with knowing that those new LLMs are going to come out and be embedded in products in the future, when you're signing up for your deals with these infrastructure providers, right? How do you actually control that, I'll call it, and drive certainty in that compute? We already talked a little bit about regulatory compliance. I think this is going to be one of the things that drives the market in the future is regulatory compliance in general. I think the EU was first really kind of pushing out regulatory stuff on generative AI. I think you're going to see the same thing in the US, and I think you're going to see a lot of big providers in the US actually I'll call it, breathe a sigh of relief when that regulatory control comes out, because it's going to slow down to a certain extent the development. They're going to have chances to recoup their investments that they've made, and it's going to act a little bit as an inhibitor of new companies coming into their space, because now the regulatory compliance hurdle is going to be there, right? So I think we're going to see it. I think the big guys are actually going to welcome it. And then the last thing I think that's a big risk is the implications associated with inaction, right? What if I don't do anything with generative AI? What's the impact if I don't move in this space? Knowing how fast things are going, knowing what a disadvantage I might be if I'm not a first mover, right? What's the implications if I don't do that, and how do I actually assess that? To me, that's a kind of the new risk profile associated with generative AI that I'm not sure a lot of companies are thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so much uncertainty, and it's still morphing into what it's going to be longer term. And you have some great points in that response. I mean, first of all, you're right. Vendor viability, 10, 20 years ago when you and I were doing this, you had to worry about that. Like, is such and such vendor going to be around? Is this vendor going to get acquired? Are they stable? And you do maybe worry about that if you're looking at a smaller ERP provider, but in general, we're not as worried about that just because the market has matured so much. But there's a lot of unknowns in this AI space, and that what'd you call it, acqui-hiring?
Acqui-hiring, right?
Acqui-hiring. I had not heard that term, but that makes total sense. I mean, and that's what a lot of tech companies have historically done, is they go out and they just hire the top brains from competitors, and what does that do to the remaining companies? What about, with all that in mind, here's a question from Darian on LinkedIn. How should organizations structure their long-term AI strategy to ensure sustainable success? So given that we don't know, there's a lot we don't know. We're still learning. We're all still trying to figure out what AI is and how we're going to use generative AI, how it might provide improved processes, more efficiency, all that good stuff. How do you define a strategy in that context? You're trying to think long term, but you're sort of here in the short term, just trying to figure out what in the world's going on.
Yeah, I did think about that question, and it was interesting, Eric. You sent me this question as something that you're probably going to talk about, and it's interesting that it came from one of the listeners as well. And so I did think about that question last night, and I came up with three things. I said, number one, right? I've got to make sure that my strategy on addressing the masses is solid. Everybody's going to have access to generative AI, right? To the extent that you can coach, control, figure out a way to leverage your entire organization and level up with generative AI, that's going to be a sound strategy. And you can look to McKinsey, EY, PwC, Accenture, all of those guys, when they were investing in generative AI, the first thing that they did is they tried to train up their entire team on how to use generative AI, right? So I don't find that to be a risky strategy of going out and figuring out how I'm going to address the masses. The second thing I would be working on is I would call it a wide breadth of quick wins. I would not be making huge investments right now in generative AI that says I'm going to build a gigantic infrastructure platform and I'm going to go fundamentally change my processes right now. I would be looking at a wide breadth of quick wins in order to be able to demonstrate kind of I'll call it the effectiveness of it and control the risk profile. Right. And then the third thing I would be thinking about is I've got to develop a portfolio management strategy that recognizes the volatility associated with the underlying assumptions associated with generative AI, meaning what's it going to cost me? What's the risk profile, right? What can it actually deliver? Because I think the risk profile is going to go down. This 93% accuracy thing that I quoted, I think that's going to, the industry recognizes that's a big problem. Right. And so that they're going to work on solving that particular problem. And when they solve that particular problem, the risk profile in general is going to go down. The cost associated with it, I think, over time is going to go down. So when you look at your portfolio, right, you've got to be able to say, I've got a portfolio of potential projects here that all have an ROI associated with it. But that ROI is not going to be static. Right. The ROI next year is going to be different than the ROI this year, even though the project might be defined the same. Let's take an example of take the example of an ERP implementation. Right. Let's be technology non-exhaustive for a second and say I'm going from a ECC to S4. Right. And I've got a brownfield process to be able to take me from one platform to another. You've probably got a cost associated right now that's associated with a vendor that gave you a couple of quotes maybe a year ago. Right. But the cost associated with making that move next year with a full set of generative AI tools in the hands of an Accenture or a Deloitte or an EY coming to you, it could be 2/3 of the cost that it was a year ago. And so does that change the ROI associated with that implementation now, where you may not have been able to afford it before, suddenly it becomes affordable, and suddenly I need to move that to the top of my portfolio, right? So that's what I would be thinking about on generative AI and how I would be thinking about my strategy today.
Yeah, that's good advice. And here's a really interesting here's an interesting question from LinkedIn user. Again, I don't know why my streaming software is not telling me the names of the people asking these questions, so I apologize. But this is from LinkedIn. And I know you touched on this a little bit, John, but I want to come back to it because I think you touched on part of the answer to this question. But in your ERP implementation, digital transformation work, do you see organization using tools like Microsoft Copilot to enhance project managers in note-taking or in development in writing code? To me, seems like a low-risk place to start with Gen AI.
Right. And that's where the systems integrators right now. And again, I can't speak from pure experience on an ERP project, but I can speak from what the systems integrators are indicating in their RFP responses as to where they're actually seeing the benefits. And those benefits are coming out of the use of that everyday AI. In order to be able to actually, see and this is like the GitHubs and the Chat GPTs and the Microsoft Copilots and, all of those Copilot things that aren't necessarily their methodologies embedded with SI or with those tools. One additional thing I think that's going to change, and it just popped into my head. So I think we're going to see methodologies and tool sets become a differentiator in the SIs that they haven't necessarily been a differentiator over the last 15 years. Because if you go back to our ERP implementation days again, right? Every company used to have their own implementation methodology associated with ERP. And then the SAPs and the Oracles were being branded with those failures, right? When something fails. So the SAP and the Oracles then had to publish and kind of push out their own methodologies, the activates, and the Oracle methods. And then all of the SIs had to be able to demonstrate that they were using that methodology as a part of the implementation. So, the differentiation occurred around the edges. So now we're talking about generative AI and the implementation of generative AI. There isn't a standard methodology out there that people can grab onto and say, this is what we're going to do, right? So every one of these firms now is kind of crafting their own methodologies to go to market with. And I think that's going to end up being a differentiator that people are going to have to consider that maybe they hadn't had to consider before.
Yeah. It's a good point. I tend to agree with you there. And here's another question from Terry on LinkedIn. Terry says, do you think that CFOs would be more engaged if they were to see AI insights in their own financials? So I'm not sure if that's asking. I'm not 100% sure what she's asking, but it might be around getting insights from the financials using AI potentially, or CFOs.
Yeah, I do. Okay. But, and I'm going to put this great big caveat on it, it can absolutely backfire. Because if the information that you're showing a CFO falls into this category of 7% of it's not an accurate assessment of what those are, and you go in and show the CFO an assessment that isn't indicative of the actual health of the company, and it's flawed in its analysis, you can set your programs back for a year, because that's going to kind of be in there. I'll call it, that's going to be the taste that was left in the mouth, right? So I think it's a good strategy, but it needs to be controlled with a risk profile of actually looking at those results and being sure and confident that the results that you're putting in front of the CFO are accurate.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, and the person asked the question around using Copilot and how that might automate some jobs. I actually opened up my LinkedIn over here on the side, and that is actually Jason on LinkedIn, so I can see it on my phone, but not on the software here. So thanks for the great question there, Jason. And Jason followed up with a comment here. Interesting viewpoint on methodologies. Thank you for the answer. So apparently he was happy with the answer you gave there. So thanks, John, for that.
Good. That's one.
Yeah, so at least one person's happy with this so far, which is better than none. So coming back to a couple things, what about, have you seen some real world examples or case studies where AI has materially impacted or improved an organization's operations? I know we sort of touched on some examples sort of in passing here, but I want to come back to that and maybe dive in a little bit more. I mean, when you look at the end organization, not the SIs or the software vendors, but the organization that's going through the transformation, are you seeing some, what's some of the low hanging fruit that's out there, would you say?
Yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time on this particular question. And what I would advise, and this is where I say you can probably get some free consulting here. Okay. But if you look at what the systems integrators are doing, PwC, Accenture, et cetera, all of these guys are developing, I'll call it an arsenal of potential use cases of generative AI associated with particular industries, right? And they will literally give that arsenal away for free. If you go in and ask them to say, hey, I'd like you to come in and give us and they know that there's a potential pot of gold associated with it, and say, so go down a path like this. Hey, we're really thinking about ramping up our investment in generative AI in 2025. And we're trying to set our budgets in 2024 in terms of what we want to spend on it. But we're unsure as to potentially what the business case is for generative AI. Can your firm come in and just provide us with an overview of where you're seeing generative AI impact our industry, and where do you think the big use cases are going to be for that, so that we can begin to kind of plan what our budget is going to be for next year? I guarantee if you go out to Accenture, Deloitte, EY, and PwC and ask each one of those firms to come in and give you an overview of that, at least one of them, and probably two of them, are going to be more than happy to do so. Right. And that's where I would trust the advice of those guys that have spent an enormous amount of time thinking about, right, where the use cases are, versus me, who I'm thinking more about the, where the systems integrators are going to get benefits. I don't know if that made sense or not, right? But
yeah, Yeah, and we're seeing clients. Just a couple examples that come to mind in the manufacturing space, especially. Just because manufacturers are generally pretty complex. They've got complex supply chains. They've got planning. They're trying to translate a demand plan into a production plan, and there's a lot of moving parts that go along with that. So we're seeing a lot of companies test out AI in those contexts. In terms of
Mhm.
getting better customer demand forecast, looking at, different macro factors and internal and external data points that maybe they hadn't really quantitatively considered it in the past, right? Instead, they go on gut feel like, well, you
Right.
know, the economy is doing this, so therefore we think our forecast is going to do this. Whereas with AI, it's again, you've got that 93% accuracy issue to work through, and it's not going to be 100% perfect, but it might get us a little bit more perfect than we as humans are capable of doing. So you look at something like a customer demand forecast, or even just MRP type stuff and planning for procurement. There's a lot of things that you could be using AI for if you plug in some of the inputs and ask it very
Right.
specific parameters. I mean, you've got to, again, it's sort of like being a leader. And back to your point about you hire the smartest person in the room, but you still have to coach them, guide them, manage them. It's the same thing with AI. It's almost like you've got another team member, really talented team member, but you've got to give that
Right.
person direction, and you've got to be clear about what you want uh,
Right.
for that to work. Yeah, so good stuff there, for sure. Now, how about, if we look ahead here and sort of pulling this all together, we look ahead. What do you see as the next big evolution in generative AI, and how could organizations be preparing for it now?
Yeah. I think it's hard to say this in the face of the change that's actually happened over the last 18 months. Okay. But I think there's going to be a slowdown in um, the advancement of generative AI. And I think there's two things that are going to drive that slowdown. Um, One, you know, there's been a huge amount of money. I think I heard a term like $600 billion that's been invested in generative AI, right?
Well,
There's got to be a recovery process associated with that investment, right? And so I think there's going to be a natural slowdown that says, hey, before we go out and invest a whole bunch more money in this next generation, we got to figure out a way to make money off the stuff that we've already developed, right? There's going to be a come to Jesus moment in all of these companies that says, I got to make my money back, right? And I think that's going to naturally slow down the market. The other
right.
thing I think that's going to naturally slow down the market is this acceleration of regulatory control. Those hurdles are going to be starting to put into place in terms of what you need to do and what you need to be transparent about in terms of going to market with a generative AI. And I think that's going to slow down the evolution a little bit, right? So it's probably controversial to say what I just said right there, but I think we're going to see a slowdown. I think the next major advancements are going to come in, I'll call it the improvement of accuracy, like we've already talked about, and the assimilation of non-textual information into those LLMs, right? So, you're going to see people take this podcast, they're going to turn it into text, and they're going to incorporate it into their large language models, right? Now that
Mhm.
that actually goes against, to a certain extent, this quality control, right? Because there's so much information that's out there in the form of videos, in the form of whatever, but the accuracy of that information has to,
Yeah,
clearly come into question. So it kind of goes against that quality statement, right? And then I think you're going to see a focus on smaller LLMs that are really job focused, right? Versus the AGI, kind of this general intelligence model of one thing can do everything, right? I think you're going to see more of a focus on smaller LLMs that are very targeted, very focused on a particular, let's call it, business function. And then your ERP packages are going to be able to kind of flip between those LLMs specific to a business function, right? Not rely on one big one, but be able to, I'll call it, harness the smaller LLMs. And
right.
then, as we've talked about, I think we're going to see a wildly different consulting market 2 years from now than we see today, as these methodologies come to fruition, right? And as these investments that these big consulting companies have made get embedded in their tools, the whole approach that they're going to take to implementing at a client site, I just think we're going to see just a fundamental shift in the way we think about how they go to market, how they price things, what their methodologies are going to look like. I don't have an answer to that right now. I just think it's going to change a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully, end customers end up being the winners here, in terms of being able to, maybe to your point earlier, though, maybe the cost savings isn't huge if it's something that's already been offshored, but if you can compress time, you can make things more effective. There's obviously some quantifiable improvements.
I think the free market always drives it to the client in the end, right? I
Yeah.
mean, if you're driving competitive, there's no way that all these companies are going to be able to say, "Oh, we're going to put in these new processes, and we're going to save 30%, and we're going to keep all that." Right? That's not going to happen.
Right.
The competitive pressure is eventually going to say, "I'm going to have to let it through. I'm going to have to let it through. I'm going to have to give it back to the client in order to be able to compete." Somebody's going to break, right? So, I think eventually it gets to the client. It's just going to be a timing thing.
Right. So I've got one last forward-looking, future-predicting question for you. It's actually not my question. This is a question that I think is a great one from Shubham on LinkedIn. Shubham says, which are the leading companies using AI in supply chain? I'll just ask you this in general, not just for supply chain, but just in general. Which are the leading companies using AI? Should IBM, Oracle, Microsoft, and SAP in the top 5 companies, or do you think they will be in the future? I guess it really, the question I would ask here is, do you think these big vendors are going to be on the forefront and the cutting edge of AI adoption and usage, or do you think that it's going to be the upstarts, the AI focused companies that end up prevailing here? What's your prediction if you had to predict the future here?
I think one of the things I've been thinking about, Eric, is and you're an expert in the ERP marketplace, more than myself, but I think that the concept of template-based ERP implementations, I think that's going to get reduced, right? And I think ultimately what you're going to see, now this might be really far out there, right? But I think ultimately what you're going to see is there's going to be some new ERP vendor that is going to enter the marketplace that is going to be configurable straight up based upon generative AI, right? So you're going to go in, you're going to put your requirements in, and it's automatically going to configure the I'll call it the tool to match those requirements specifically. So rather than a company having to compromise its process in order to be able to fit within a template of so-called business best practices, there's going to be a swing back to the competitive advantage of my own processes and allowing generative AI to kind of configure those processes within an ERP platform. And I don't think that ERP platform provider exists today. I don't think that's SAP. I don't think that's Oracle. I don't think it's any of the big guys. I think ultimately you're going to see a new guy that's going to come into the market, that's going to take over this, that's going to enter the space with the completely configurable generative AI ERP package. And that's what's going to shake everything up.
That's super interesting, because it kind of makes sense. I mean, because you almost, if you're SAP, Oracle, one of those guys, you're almost going to have to tear it down and burn it and start over to be able to do what you're saying. I mean, you can't do it in the current architecture, the legacy architectures that they've been working from. And it's also a great business idea. I mean, you and I should, we could announce it right here today. Say, hey, Don and I are starting a software company. We're looking for investors. Who's in? And we'll call it Belden Software. I don't know. We'll think of something there that combines our names. But no, it's a great idea. It's a great point, and it makes total sense. I can see that happening too now that you say it. So super interesting. Well, I appreciate you being here today, John. I know we could spend hours on this, and maybe we will someday. But appreciate you being here today, and appreciate all the great audience questions here as well.
Well, it's really great to speak with you again, Eric, anytime.
Absolutely, yeah. And how do people get a hold of you? What's the best way to follow you? Where can they find your blog? All that stuff.
I think we're available on upperedge.com. I think that's the best place. And then if you just wanted to email me directly, it's jbelden@upperedge.com. And if I can't answer your question and it deals with, I'll call it the procurement function or buying products, I certainly can forward it to the right people.
Absolutely. And if you're listening to the audio only version of this podcast, just so you know, Belden is spelled Belden. So Belden at upperedge.com. And then, of course, upperedge.com is where they can find the blog and all that good stuff, too. So,
Right.
Good stuff. Well, thanks again, John. Really appreciate you being here. And thanks to the audience for being here. Watch out for this interview. We're going to edit it, add some more content to it. It'll become part of a Transformation Ground Control podcast episode that is released, I think, 3 weeks from tomorrow, I believe it is. So keep an eye out for it. You'll see this again, along with some other content. You can find us same time, same place every Tuesday. We're streaming to YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, covering different digital transformation topics, of course, from a tech agnostic and objective perspective. So you can find us same time, same place. And new episodes of Transformation Ground Control drop every Wednesday. So tomorrow you'll see a new episode as well. So be sure to check out transformationgroundcontrol.com. As always, my name is Eric Kimberling. Thanks for being here today, and we'll